This is Berlin, May 1945, or what's left of it. Smoke still clings to the skeletons of buildings, and in the heart of the rubble lies the Reich Chancellery. Its marble halls are shattered. Its grand columns are toppled like ancient bones. This was meant to be the center of a new world order, a 1,000-year empire. Now it's a tombstone. How did one man's obsession with buildings lead to the destruction of an entire continent? To answer that, we have to go back before the bombs, before the armies, before the screaming crowds. We have to go back to a cold street in Vienna. The year is 1908. A young man named Adolf Hitler is staring at a piece of paper in his hand. It's a rejection letter. The crisp white sheet feels like a judgment. For the second time, the Vienna Academy of Fine Arts has told him he is not good enough. His portfolio, filled with painstakingly detailed drawings of Vienna's grand buildings, was dismissed. The professors saw technical skill, certainly, but they saw no life, no soul, no artist, just a draftsman. For the 19-year-old Hitler, this isn't a career setback. It is a fundamental rejection of his very being. He believed he was a genius, an undiscovered master destined to create beauty that would echo through the ages. And these blind academic fools had failed to recognize him. Imagine the bitterness. He's alone in a city that feels vast and indifferent. He sleeps in cheap men's hostels that smell of unwashed bodies and boiled cabbage. He survives by selling small painted postcards to tourists, little cityscapes of churches and palaces. They are precise, they are accurate, but they are cold. The people in his paintings, when he bothers to include them at all, are just tiny, featureless figures. Placeholders. The buildings are the real subjects, the stone, the arches, the domes. That's where he pours all his attention. He sees architecture as the ultimate expression of power and permanence. A painting can be hidden away. A building dominates the skyline. It forces itself upon the world. It declares the glory of its creator for centuries. This is the immortality he craves. Day after day, he wanders the streets of Vienna, filling sketchbooks with the city's imperial architecture, the Hofburg Palace, the State Opera. He studies their classical lines, their monumental scale. He's not just observing, he's absorbing a language, the language of empire. He looks at the modern buildings going up, the new art styles in the galleries, and feels nothing but disgust. He sees weakness, decadence, a world that has lost its way, that celebrates ugliness and forgets the eternal truths of classical beauty. His truth, his bitterness hardens into a world view. The world hasn't just rejected him. It has rejected greatness itself. He is a victim, but he is also a prophet in a world of Philistines. This narrative, born in the sting of artistic failure, will become the foundation for everything that follows. It's a question that haunts historians. What if he had been accepted? If one professor had seen a flicker of talent and decided to nurture it, would his obsession have been satisfied with canvas and watercolor? Or was the scale of his ambition always too vast for a simple art studio? Something crucial was happening inside that young man's mind. His creative energy, blocked from its intended path, began to seek a new outlet. It started to mutate. He left Vienna for Munich, another city of art, but the pattern repeated itself. more poverty, more rejection, more time spent in beer halls listening to the angry political speeches that filled the air after Germany's defeat in the Great War. And here he found a new kind of art, the art of the spoken word. He watched speakers hold audiences of hundreds, then thousands in a trance. He saw how they could mold a crowd's anger and fear into a single unified emotion. It was like sculpting, but with human souls. He began to practice. He'd rehearse speeches in his tiny room, experimenting with gestures, with pauses, with the rising crescendo of his voice. This was a new kind of composition. The canvas was no longer paper. It was the German people. The medium was not paint. It was ideology. He discovered he had a talent for it, a terrifying talent. He could take the vague resentments of a defeated nation and give them a shape, a target, a grand, dramatic story of betrayal and promised redemption. His failure as a painter of buildings was being transformed into a new, far more ambitious project, becoming the architect of a nation. His old sketchbooks were still with him, but now the drawings began to change. Alongside the cathedrals and opera houses, new visions appeared, colossal structures that dwarfed anything in Vienna or Munich, impossible arches, domes that scraped the sky, grand boulevards designed for marching armies, not for people. These weren't sketches of existing places anymore. They were blueprints for a world that did not yet exist. A world built in his own image, clean, ordered, monumental, and purged of everything he considered weak or impure. The artist who couldn't get into art school was now designing a new reality. He had found his true calling. Politics was not just a path to power. For Adolf Hitler, politics was the ultimate art form. It was the only canvas large enough for his ego. He would no longer ask for permission from academic committees. He would build his new world himself, grinding down the old one and using its dust as mortar. The man who was told he had no soul in his art was now ready to reshape the soul of a country. He had the vision, he had the will, and soon he would have the absolute power to make his stone and steel fantasies real. But he was still just a draftsman. He could sketch the dream, but he couldn't build it. He needed a collaborator, someone with the technical skill, the professional legitimacy to turn his megalomaniacal drawings into concrete reality. If this failed artist now has the power to build anything he wants, who would be foolish or ambitious enough to become his architect? In 1931, a sound began to haunt the quiet modernist offices of Germany's architectural elite. It was a sound of distant thunder on a clear day, a low rhythmic roar that would swell and then fade, carried on the Berlin wind. For Albert Speer, a brilliant young architect bored with designing perfect soulless boxes, that sound would be a siren's call. He stood in a room of his own creation. The lines were perfect. The light, filtered through a large plate glass window, was clean and cold. Every surface was smooth, rational, and utterly devoid of passion. Speer was 26 years old, the latest in a dynasty of successful architects. He had the talent, the pedigree, the handsome face. He had everything except a purpose. His life felt like this room, technically flawless and completely empty. His latest client, a wealthy tire manufacturer named Herr Gruber, inspected the model for his new villa. Gruber was a man who understood rubber and steel, not form and spirit. He ran a thick finger over the miniature roof and called the design very clean, very functional. Speer explained that this was the essence of modern design, a house as a machine for living. But he had shown Gruber another sketch first, one with a small colonnade, a hint of classical grandeur. Gruber had waved it away. That was the past, he'd said. Men of the new age needed practical, efficient designs, not theatrics. The word stung. Theatrics. Speer looked at the perfect little box on the table. Another commission secured, another piece of his soul sold for a respectable fee. He dreamed of building for pharaohs, but he was stuck designing for merchants. He longed for a patron with the vision of an emperor, but his world was run by men who saw beauty only in a balance sheet. As Gruber droned on about costs, Speer heard it again, that distant roar, the sound of thousands chanting in unison, seeming to shake the very glass in the window. His university students were talking about the rallies, about the man with the strange mustache who could hold an audience in a trance for hours. Most of Speer's colleagues dismissed it as vulgar politics, street brawlers and failed painters playing at Revolution. But Speer wasn't interested in the politics. He was interested in the stagecraft. He wondered how one man could command so much attention, what kind of space could contain such energy. He decided to go, not as a convert, but as an architect studying a new kind of public theater. He went to a sports palace in the west of Berlin. The moment he entered, the sensory overload was staggering. The air was thick, heavy with the smell of sweat, wet wool, and cheap beer. The sharp, oily scent of torch fuel hung over everything. It was a far cry from the clean, sterile rooms he designed. This was raw. It was alive. He found a place in the crowd, feeling the press of bodies around him. These weren't his refined clients. They were shopkeepers, factory workers, unemployed clerks, and students with fire in their eyes. Then the lights went down. A single spotlight cut through the smoky darkness, illuminating a podium. Vast crimson banners with stark black symbols unfurled from the rafters, seeming to drink the light. He watched, not as a potential convert, but as a technician. He noted the dramatic timing, the use of shadow and light. He saw how the flags created towering vertical lines, transforming a simple sports hall into something that felt ancient, monumental, a cathedral of raw power. And then the man walked onto the stage. The roar that Speer had only heard from a distance was now a physical force. It hit him in the chest, a wave of sound so powerful it felt like it could stop his heart. He saw the faces of the people around him. They were transformed. Their individual worries and daily frustrations melted away, replaced by a single, shared expression of hypnotic devotion. They weren't listening to a speech. They were participating in a ritual. The speaker's voice began low and guttural, then climbed, spiraling into furious crescendos before falling into conspiratorial whispers. Speer didn't focus on the words, on the talk of betrayal and destiny. He focused on the rhythm, the structure, the masterful composition of emotion. He, an architect of stone and steel, was witnessing an architect of human souls. This was not a political argument. It was a performance. It was grand opera. It was the theatrics that men like Herr Gruber dismissed, but magnified 1,000 times. made real and terrifying and seductive. He walked home through the cold Berlin night. The streets felt silent, empty. The roar of the rally was still ringing in his ears. He wasn't thinking about political parties or economic policy. He was thinking about scale, about vision. The world he knew, the world of sensible commissions and minimalist villas, suddenly seemed impossibly small, pathetic. He unlocked the door to his pristine, quiet office. The model for Herr Gruber's house sat on the central table, perfectly lit, an emblem of his successful, mediocre life. He walked over to it, looked at it for a long moment, and then swept it off the table with a single, violent motion. The delicate construction shattered against the polished floor. From a locked drawer, he pulled out a hidden portfolio and unrolled the sketches inside. These were not for any client. They were for himself, drawings he'd made in secret late at night. Here was a triumphal arch that would make the one in Paris look like a toy. Here was a great hall with a dome so vast it could hold 100,000 people, a dome that would dwarf St. Peter's Basilica. Here was an avenue wider and longer than the Champs-Élysées, designed for parades of 1,000,000 soldiers. These were the dreams of a pharaoh, the fantasies of an emperor, fantasies he believed would forever remain on paper. But as he looked at the impossible scale of his own drawings, he saw the face of the man on the stage. He heard the roar of the crowd. And for the first time, he understood. The power needed to build such things did not come from wealthy industrialists or government committees. It came from this, from the ability to bend the will of a nation into a single, sharp point. The sterile modernism he had mastered was a lie. It was an architecture of restraint, of apology. The future, he now realized, would be built not with glass and quiet elegance, but with millions of tons of granite and the force of a hurricane. He would join the party. He would offer his skills. He would find the man on the stage, because Albert Speer, the bored architect in his empty room, had just found his pharaoh, his emperor, his ultimate client. He didn't want a building. He wanted a weapon, a psychological weapon, forged not from steel, but from space, shadow, and light. In 1934, Albert Speer was handed his first monumental task. It wasn't a skyscraper or a museum. It was a field, the Zeppelin Field in Nuremberg, the grounds for the annual party rally. But Speer wasn't just building a stage. He was being asked to design a religious experience for a new dark faith. The previous year's rally had been a visual failure. Temporary wooden structures looked cheap and flimsy, sagging under the weight of banners. Hitler was furious. He remembered the grand architecture of the Catholic Church and the Roman Empire. He understood that power needed a stage, one that felt permanent, ancient, even when it was brand new. He told Speer he wanted something that would last, something that would inspire awe, and he wanted it in a matter of weeks. This was Speer's first real test. He was the new man, the young architect who had caught the Führer's eye. But the old guard was watching. Party officials, men who had been with Hitler for years, saw Speer as an outsider, an arrogant technocrat from a wealthy family. They controlled the budgets, the materials, the manpower. Every request Speer made was met with delays, with skepticism. They were waiting for him to fail. Speer knew he couldn't build a coliseum out of granite in 2 months. The deadlines were impossible, the resources limited. So he made a clever pivot. He presented Hitler with a sketch, but it wasn't a drawing of a building. It was a drawing of a ruin. He explained his theory of ruin value, the idea that any great structure should be designed to one day decay beautifully. Like the Roman Forum, its ruins would still whisper of an empire's power thousands of years later. Hitler was captivated. This was a language he understood, not of budgets or engineering, but of legacy and immortality. Here was an architect thinking not about next year's rally, but about the year 3000. In that moment, the bond between them solidified. Hitler saw more than an architect. He saw a fellow artist, a man who could translate his grandiose visions into concrete, stone, and reality. But the immediate problem remained. How do you create a sense of eternal grandeur with plywood and plaster? The main grandstand was being built, but it was just a shell. Speer needed something more, something to define the vast, empty space of the field at night. He needed to build a room for 200,000 people, a room without walls. The idea came not from an architecture book, but from a military report. He had seen what a few anti-aircraft searchlights could do to the night sky, and he imagined what hundreds more could achieve. He went to Hitler with a gamble, a proposal so audacious it was almost insane. He asked for 152 of the German Air Force's most powerful anti-aircraft searchlights. The military commanders were outraged. These weren't stage lights. They were strategic assets, vital for the defense of the nation. Giving them to an architect for a party rally was unthinkable. But Speer wasn't asking them. He was asking Hitler, and Hitler, the frustrated artist, saw the vision instantly. He overruled his generals. Speer would have his lights. The night of the rally arrived, a cold, clear evening in September. The field was a sea of darkness, filled with the murmuring of a massive crowd, a feeling of anticipation mixed with uncertainty. Then, on Speer's command, a switch was thrown. 152 pillars of pure incandescent light shot 13,000 feet into the sky, converging at a single point high above. They created the illusion of a vast, roofless cathedral. The effect was breathtaking, ethereal, overwhelming. The crowd gasped, suddenly standing inside a structure made of nothing but focused energy. It was a space both immense and intimate, a temple without a god, waiting for one to ascend the stage. For a few nights, Albert Speer had created the most powerful piece of architecture in the world, and it was an illusion, a beautiful, terrifying illusion. Hitler was ecstatic. He called it the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. Speer hadn't just built a stage, he had built a sacred space. He had used the very tools of modern warfare to create an atmosphere of mystical devotion. He had proven he was more than a builder. He was a master of spectacle. He had passed the test. We look at the black and white photos today, the columns of light cutting through the darkness. It's easy to use the word beautiful. The scale is majestic. The concept is genius. But this is the treacherous nature of this story. Can propaganda be beautiful? Can an aesthetic designed to mesmerize a nation, to strip away individual thought and replace it with collective adoration for a tyrant, ever be truly beautiful? Or is it something else? A perfect vessel for an ugly purpose? The Cathedral of Light was a triumph, but it was temporary, vanishing the moment the generators were turned off. Speer had proven he could conjure magic from thin air, that he could build a temple out of light itself. Now, Hitler was ready to give him a real project, a permanent one, a project built not from light, but from millions of tons of stone and millions of broken lives. On his 50th birthday, Adolf Hitler isn't reviewing troops. He isn't poring over battle plans or delivering a thunderous speech to the masses. He is in a room, almost alone, his eyes fixed with a fervent intensity on a vast, intricate model of a city. His city, a metropolis that does not yet exist, but which lives, breathes, and towers in his mind. He called it Germania. The Cathedral of Light had proven to Hitler that Albert Speer didn't just understand architecture, he understood power. He could sculpt with light and stone, creating not just buildings, but emotions, awe, submission, unity. Hitler saw in the young, ambitious architect a perfect tool, a man with the technical skill to execute a vision that bordered on madness. On January 30th, 1937, the appointment was made official. Albert Speer became the general building inspector for the Reich capital. The title sounded bureaucratic, even dull, but it was a key, unlocking the dream. Speer was given a budget that was, for all intents and purposes, limitless. He was given authority that superseded city planners and local government. He answered to one man and one man only. Their work began immediately, less a professional relationship and more a feverish, obsessive collaboration. They would meet for hours, often late into the night, long after the business of the state was done. In a studio at the Chancellery, the floor would be littered with sketches, blueprints, and reference books on classical Rome. Hitler, the failed artist, was finally given a canvas the size of a continent and a master draftsman to bring his strokes to life. He would pace the room, gesticulating wildly, his voice rising with excitement. He demanded the dome be higher, that it must dwarf St. Peter's in Rome. He wanted a German peasant to enter the great hall and be crushed by its grandeur. Speer would listen patiently, nodding, then translate Hitler's raw, emotional outburst into the cold, hard language of engineering. He calculated the load-bearing requirements, the stress on the steel, the sheer tonnage of granite required. He was the enabler, the man who made the impossible seem practical. They were like gods, shaping a world from nothing. If you could build a perfect city from scratch, you might start with a quiet park, a grand library, or comfortable homes. For Hitler and Speer, the answer was a declaration of power, an axis of triumph. After 2 years of relentless work, the vision was ready to be unveiled, not just on paper, but in 3 dimensions. In a former exhibition hall, Speer's team constructed a colossal model of central Germania. It was enormous, filling the entire room. Built from wood and plaster and painted a sterile uniform white, it was a city of ghosts. Hitler visited it constantly. He would have the room's lighting adjusted to simulate the time of day, watching shadows crawl across his miniature boulevards. He would get down on his knees, his eyes level with the model, to see the city from the perspective of a single citizen looking up in awe. This was his sanctuary, his true reality. The centerpiece of this future city was the north-south axis. a grand boulevard, 120 meters wide, stretching for over 7 kilometers. It would make the Champs-Élysées in Paris look like a narrow alley. Lining this great road would be the new ministries, corporate headquarters, and palaces of the Reich, all uniform, all neoclassical, all stone. At the southern end stood a monument to victory, a triumphal arch 117 meters high. It was designed to be so immense that the Arc de Triomphe could fit neatly inside its opening. Carved into its walls would be the names of every German soldier killed in the First World War, all 1.8 million of them. It was a monument not just to victory, but to sacrifice, a constant reminder of the price of glory. But moving north along the axis, the eye is drawn to the true heart of Germania, the structure that dominated the skyline and the imagination, the Volkshalle, the Great Hall. The building itself would be over 300 meters tall. Its great copper-plated dome, 290 meters in diameter, would be 16 times larger than the dome of St. Peter's Basilica. At its peak, a giant golden eagle, wings spread, clutching a swastika. Inside, the main chamber would have no seats. It was a space for 180,000 people to stand, shoulder to shoulder, and gaze up at the podium, at the single man who would speak from it. The model was beautiful in its cold perfection, a testament to order and strength. But when engineers later studied the blueprints, they discovered a chilling purpose hidden in the design. The sheer size and curved shape of the dome would create a unique acoustic effect. A speaker's voice, even amplified, wouldn't be clear. It would echo, reverberate, and blend into a disorienting, overwhelming roar. The hall wasn't designed for communication. It was designed for intimidation. And there was another, stranger detail. A space that vast could not be heated. In the winter, the collective body heat and breath of 180,000 people would rise, hit the cold inner surface of the massive dome, and condense. Clouds would form. The building would create its own weather system. A light drizzle could fall upon the assembled crowd indoors. This was not a shelter for humanity. It was a force of nature designed to diminish the individual into nothingness. The model in the exhibition hall was perfect. It was white, clean, and silent. But outside the hall's doors was the real Berlin, a chaotic, vibrant living city, a city full of people in apartments, on streets, running businesses right where the Great Hall and the Triumphal Arch were supposed to stand. To build the dream, reality had to be cleared away. Entire neighborhoods would be demolished, thousands of buildings torn down. The model asked no questions and felt no guilt. But to build it in the real world required land, and that land was already occupied. Tens of thousands of Berliners would have to be displaced. The plan for where they would go was already taking shape. A simple, brutal solution found by looking at the city's housing maps. A solution that began with a list of names and a list of addresses. The year is 1938. In a quiet apartment building in Berlin's Tiergarten district, a family is packing. Not for a holiday, not for a move to a better life. They are packing because they have to. A gramophone plays a soft tune, a sound completely at odds with the frantic, silent panic in the room. The father carefully wraps porcelain figures in newspaper. The mother folds clothes into a worn leather suitcase. Their son, no older than 10, watches from the doorway, clutching a small wooden horse. A knock at the door, not a friendly rap, but a firm official sound that cuts through the music. The father opens it to a man in a dark suit holding a clipboard. The man doesn't speak. He simply hands over a letter. The letterhead reads, General Building Inspector for the Reich Capital. The message is simple. They have 24 hours to vacate the premises. The building is scheduled for demolition. Their home, their life, their memories, all of it stood in the way of a dream that was becoming reality, one evicted family at a time. Back in Albert Speer's office, Berlin was not a city of homes and families. It was a map, a vast blueprint spread across a massive table. For Speer, the challenge of Germania was not a question of morality. It was a problem of logistics, of geometry and engineering. To build the grand north-south axis, a boulevard wider than the Champs-Élysées, a huge swathe of the city had to be erased. Entire neighborhoods needed to vanish. 75,000 people had to be moved. On paper, they were just a number, a logistical hurdle to be overcome. The scale model of Germania, pristine in its dedicated hall, had no room for the messiness of human life. It was a vision of sterile perfection. To achieve that perfection in the real world, the city first had to be purified, cleansed. As the master organizer, Speer was given the power to do it. His new department, the GBI, was granted sweeping authority to seize property, terminate leases, and relocate citizens, all for the good of the Reich's great project. First, a few eviction notices went out, then hundreds, then thousands. The process was cold, bureaucratic, and terrifyingly efficient. Forms were filled out in triplicate, orders were signed, a vast administrative machine whirred into motion, its gears grinding away the lives of ordinary people. At the heart of this machine sat Albert Speer. We have the documents, internal memos requesting the clearing of residential blocks, decrees authorizing the seizure of apartments. At the bottom of each page, a familiar, confident signature, A. Speer. He would later claim he was simply an architect, a technician. But these papers show a man wielding immense power, directly overseeing the dispossession of tens of thousands of his fellow citizens. But there was a pattern to the chaos, a dark logic behind who was forced out first. The initial targets were almost exclusively Jewish families. This was no coincidence. It was policy. The grand dream of Germania was becoming linked with the Nazi Party's other, more sinister obsession. The urban renewal project was now a tool of racial persecution. Imagine a Jewish family who had lived in their apartment for generations, given one day's notice to leave. They pack what little they can carry and are forced out onto the street. But their apartment doesn't stay empty for long. Within days, a new family moves in, an Aryan German family, perhaps one displaced from another area, or simply one deemed more worthy. Speer's GBI was the instrument of a massive citywide property transfer. It was theft on an industrial scale disguised as urban planning. So, what happened to the evicted Jewish families? They weren't relocated to new homes. They were herded into so-called Jew houses, designated apartment blocks where multiple families were crammed into spaces meant for one. These buildings became holding pins. They were waypoints on a journey that, for most, would end in the ghettos of the East, and then the camps. The clean lines on Speer's blueprints were being drawn over the ugly reality of ethnic cleansing. Hitler was delighted. For him, this was the perfect synthesis of his two great passions, creation and destruction. While he and Speer spent evenings admiring the scale model of the Volkshalle, the real foundations for that hall were being laid by hollowing out the Jewish community of Berlin. The construction of the New World required the annihilation of the old. The dictator had his vision, and in Speer he had the architect with the technical means to achieve it. At his trial in Nuremberg years later, Albert Speer would construct his most enduring creation, the myth of his own ignorance. He would tell the world he was an apolitical artist, a technocrat, obsessed with his work. He knew nothing of the regime's worst crimes. He was just clearing apartments. He was just moving tenants. But when does moving tenants become an act of persecution? At what point does a signature on a form become a weapon? The pen that approved a blueprint was the same pen that signed an eviction order. The eye that admired the beauty of a stone facade was the same eye that looked away from the human cost of acquiring it. By 1939, the work was well underway. Vast areas of central Berlin were being flattened. Entire streets, once teeming with life, were reduced to rubble. Speer had delivered. He had cleared the land. The canvas was blank, ready for the architect's grand design. The great north-south axis was no longer just a line on a map. It was a scar carved through the heart of the city. The ground was prepared. The space for monuments meant to last 1,000 years was secured. But monuments like these cannot be built from brick and plaster. They demand a material that can withstand the centuries and speak of eternal power. They require stone, vast quantities of granite and marble. But where does a regime preparing for a world war find that much stone? And more importantly, whose hands would be forced to cut it from the earth? Imagine a building, beautiful, imposing. Its facade is made of perfectly cut gray granite, clean lines, symmetrical windows. It projects power and permanence. Now get closer, so close that the texture of the stone fills your entire vision. Every stone has a story, and these stones, they scream. The model of Germania was perfect, a city of pristine white plaster and flawless miniature marble. But to build it in the real world, Albert Speer needed materials. He needed concrete, steel, and above all, stone. Not just any stone, he needed granite. Rivers of granite, mountains of it. Strong, eternal Aryan stone for a capital that would last 1,000 years. The demand was immense. The Great Hall alone required more cut stone than had been used in all the pyramids of Egypt. And so the search began. In the rolling green hills of Austria, near the town of Mauthausen, they found what they were looking for, a vast deposit of the highest quality granite. But a quarry is useless without men to work it. This is where the architect's dream takes its darkest turn. In 1938, Speer helped found a new company. Its name sounded harmless, almost mundane, Deutsche Erd- und Steinwerke, the German Earth and Stone Works, or DAST. This company, controlled by the SS, was given a simple task: provide the granite for Germania. The method was just as simple. They would use prisoners. The Mauthausen concentration camp was built right next to the quarry. It wasn't a secret death camp hidden in the woods. It was an industrial site, a factory of human misery designed for maximum output. The main feature of this factory was a set of 186 rough-hewn stone steps. They climbed steeply from the bottom of the quarry to the top. The prisoners gave it a name, the Todesstiege, the Stairs of Death. Imagine this. It's 5 in the morning. The air is so cold it burns your lungs. You are given a thin uniform, wooden shoes, and nothing else. Your job is to carry a block of granite on your back up those stairs. The blocks are jagged. They weigh 50 kilograms, sometimes more. The steps are uneven, often slick with ice or rain or blood. You join a long, shuffling line of other skeletal figures. You can't stop. You can't rest. If you slow down, a guard's boot finds your back. If you stumble, you don't just fall. You create a domino effect, a cascade of broken bodies and sharp stone tumbling back down the line. The guards at the top would sometimes make bets, timing prisoners or pushing one at random just to watch the chaos. This wasn't just labor. It was extermination through labor, and every stone that made it to the top was destined for the glorious boulevards of Germania. The clean blueprints on Speer's desk in Berlin were connected to this place. Every perfect line he drew, every grand arch he designed, created a new order for more stone. His demand for quality and quantity traveled down a chain of command, ending with a whip cracking over a prisoner's back on those stairs. Speer, the meticulous organizer, needed a reliable supply chain. Mauthausen was his supply chain. The prisoners were his raw materials. For decades after the war, Speer constructed his most enduring creation, the myth of his own ignorance. He admitted to visiting Mauthausen. He even had photographs from his trip. He wrote in his memoirs that he was shown a model facility. He saw clean barracks, he said, a modern kitchen. He praised the efficiency of the stoneworks. He claimed he saw nothing of the quarry, nothing of the stairs of death. He was just an artist, an architect, concerned with aesthetics, not the day-to-day running of a camp. He drew a line between his grand vision and the ugly reality required to build it. But history has a way of holding on to receipts. For years, his story held. It was the story of the good Nazi, the apolitical technocrat who was seduced by power, but kept his hands clean. Then a photograph surfaced, not one of Speer's own carefully selected images of a tidy camp. This one was different. It shows Albert Speer, tall and imposing in his long leather coat, standing with several SS officers. They aren't in the model barracks. They are on a ridge looking down, and laid out below them in sickening detail is the entire brutal panorama of the quarry. The long line of prisoners is clearly visible, struggling up the stairs of death. He is not looking away, he is observing, he is inspecting his investment. In that single frozen moment, his entire defense shatters. The wall he built between his office and the quarry crumbles. He wasn't just the man who ordered the stone. He was a witness. He saw the human price tag attached to every single block. He saw the machine he had helped to create, and he saw that it was working exactly as designed. This forces a deeply uncomfortable question. Can you ever truly admire a building if you know it was built by slaves? Can you separate the beauty of the art from the horror of its creation? When you look at that granite facade now, you don't just see stone. You see the ghosts of Mauthausen. You see the 186 steps. By late 1939, the world had changed. The invasion of Poland ignited a fire that would consume Europe. Suddenly, steel was needed for tanks, not girders. Concrete was for bunkers, not foundations. The grand construction sites of Germania fell quiet. The dream was put on hold, deferred until after the final victory. For a moment, it seemed Speer's role might diminish, but Hitler's admiration for his young architect had only grown. He saw in Speer not just an artist, but a peerless organizer, a man who could make enormous, complex systems work with ruthless efficiency. The war effort needed a man like that. Hitler had a new, more urgent job for his master builder. What happens when the architect of cities is asked to become the architect of war? February 1942. A plane carrying the Reich's Minister of Armaments takes off from Hitler's headquarters in East Prussia. It never lands. In the fiery wreckage, the German war effort has lost its leader. Fritz Todt, the man running the vast machinery of production, is dead. Hitler needs a replacement, immediately. He needs an organizational genius, a master of logistics, someone who can bend the entire German economy to the will of the front lines. He doesn't choose a general. He doesn't pick a seasoned industrialist. He summons his architect. Albert Speer is at the Wolf's Lair when the news arrives. He's there to discuss blueprints, to show Hitler new models for the grand avenues of Germania. He is a man of stone and light, not steel and explosives. When Hitler offers him the position, Speer is stunned. He protests, saying he knows nothing about armaments, that he is completely unqualified for the most critical job in the wartime Reich. Hitler simply waves a hand, dismissing his concerns. "I know you," he says. "I know you can do it." In that moment, Speer's mind begins to work. He sees the war not as a conflict of ideologies, but as a colossal engineering problem, a messy, inefficient project that needed a master builder. If he could solve it, streamline it into victory, then he could finally get back to his real work, building the future. He accepts. The architect immediately goes to work, treating the German war economy like one of his building sites. He sees inefficiency, waste, and corruption everywhere. The old party loyalists, cronies like Hermann Goering, who ran the Air Force like a private fiefdom, stood in his way. With Hitler's absolute backing, Speer simply pushes them aside. He creates committees not of politicians, but of engineers and factory managers. He centralizes command. He rationalizes every step of the process, from sourcing raw steel to the final coat of paint on a Panzer tank. He applies the cold, clean logic of a blueprint to the chaotic reality of total war. The results are staggering. They call it the armaments miracle. Within 6 months, tank production triples. Ammunition output soars by nearly 300%. The manufacturing of fighter planes, once a bottleneck of competing interests, doubles. Speer is in constant motion. No longer bent over a drafting table in a quiet studio, he is now on the factory floor, his tailored suit collecting the dust of industry. He speaks to workers, charms industrialists, and outmaneuvers political rivals with quiet, ruthless efficiency. He becomes one of the most powerful men in Europe. The artist who once designed ethereal cathedrals of light is now designing the supply chains for weapons of death. But every miracle has a price. Every number on Speer's production charts has a dark story behind it. This sudden surge of productivity didn't come from German engineering alone or clever organization. The architect's miracle was built on a foundation of human suffering on a scale that is almost impossible to comprehend. It was built on the backs of 12 million slave laborers, 12 million human beings. They were pulled from every corner of occupied Europe. French resistance fighters, Polish intellectuals, Russian civilians, men, women, and children rounded up, packed into cattle cars, and shipped into the heart of the Reich. They were no longer people. They were Stück, pieces, units of labor. Speer's memos from this period are chillingly clear. He doesn't ask for workers. He demands manpower. He requests bodies. He calculates their value in terms of output per day. Imagine the scene: a vast, echoing factory hall, the air thick with the smell of metal and sweat. Thousands of foreign laborers, their faces gaunt, their clothes little more than rags, work the machines for 12, 14, 16 hours a day. They are fed watery soup and a slice of stale bread. They sleep in crowded, unheated barracks, dozens to a room. If they slow down, they are beaten. If they collapse, they are dragged away. Many simply die at their workstations. And on a raised platform, observing the scene, is Albert Speer. He sees the process. He sees the efficiency. He sees the numbers going up. He is not a camp commandant. He is a manager, solving a technical problem. He saw production targets, not people. He saw units of labor, not human lives. This raises a terrifying question. Who bears the greater responsibility for a crime? The fanatic who screams the hateful ideology? Or the calm, rational technocrat who designs the system that makes the ideology brutally, efficiently real? Speer didn't write the hateful pamphlets. He didn't give the speeches at the rallies. He just built the machine. He made the trains run on time, carrying millions to the factories and the camps. He made sure the quarries produced the granite and the factories produced the guns. He was the great enabler, the man whose genius for organization kept the Nazi war effort alive long after it should have collapsed under its own weight. By 1943, Speer is at the absolute peak of his power. He has Hitler's ear. He controls a vast economic empire. The architect of Germania has become the architect of total war. He is, by any measure, the second most powerful man in the Third Reich. But power is an illusion when the foundations are cracking. On the frozen plains of Russia, a catastrophe is unfolding. An entire German army, the Sixth Army, is surrounded at Stalingrad. They are freezing, starving, and being systematically destroyed. All of Speer's tanks, all of his ammunition cannot save them. The dream of Germania was built on the promise of inevitable victory, but the war is being lost. What happens to a master builder when his world starts to fall apart? What does he build then? The year is 1943. Albert Speer is at the peak of his power. He is no longer just an architect. He is the Minister of Armaments, the master of the German war economy. His office is a testament to his new role. The walls are not covered in blueprints for grand halls, but in charts, production figures, quotas for tanks, shells, aircraft. He has traded stone for steel, building a war machine instead of a city. An aide enters his office, quiet and efficient, placing a single memorandum on Speer's vast desk. It's from the administrative office of Heinrich Himmler, the SS. The memo is routine, another request in a mountain of paperwork. It asks for a large quantity of cement and reinforced steel and priority transport on the railways. The destination is a remote location in the east. A special project, the memo calls it, near a small Polish town few had ever heard of, a town called Auschwitz. For Speer, it was just another logistical problem to solve, another set of numbers on a page. But this piece of paper was not a request for a factory. It was a purchase order for a nightmare, and Speer's signature was the key that unlocked the warehouse. In October of that same year, the leaders of the Reich gathered in a gilded hall in the city of Posen. The audience was a collection of the most powerful and ruthless men in the Nazi state. On the stage stood Heinrich Himmler. For 3 hours, he spoke. He didn't use euphemisms or hide behind bureaucratic language. He spoke plainly, openly, about the extermination of the Jewish people. He called it a page of glory in their history. He told the assembled leaders that they all knew what it meant when 100 corpses lie side by side, or 500, or 1,000. Albert Speer was in that audience. He was scheduled to speak right after Himmler, but according to his testimony years later, he never heard those words. He claimed he left the hall early for a meeting back in Berlin. Another time, he said he was feeling unwell. His story changed, but the core of it remained the same. I did not hear it. I did not know. It was his greatest performance, the construction of his most enduring alibi. But history is not always written by the words spoken on a stage. It is also written in the quiet ink of memos and supply ledgers. And the paper trail leading from Speer's ministry to the camps is undeniable. A request for 5,000 tons of cement for Birkenau. Approved. A requisition for prefabricated barracks to house laborers. Approved. A demand for specialized ventilation equipment. Approved. His department didn't just know about the camps, it was an essential partner in their construction and expansion. Imagine the sheer scale of it. You are the man in charge of all German production. Nothing moves, nothing is built without your knowledge. You control the railways. You allocate the concrete. You approve the shipments of wire. Do you ever ask what the wire is for? Do you ever wonder why one remote camp needs more concrete than a small city? Speer's defense was that he was a technocrat. He saw only the numbers. He saw a request for materials, and he filled it. He didn't ask questions. He was too busy winning the war. This was the firewall he built in his own mind. A wall between the clean, efficient world of his charts and the filthy reality of what those charts enabled. He could visit a factory making tank engines one day and approve a shipment of wood for crematoria the next. To him, they were both just resources, part of the total war effort. He perfected the art of not knowing. He turned willful blindness into a principle of management. For decades after the war, this was the narrative he sold to the world. And the world, for the most part, bought it. He was the good Nazi, the apolitical genius who was seduced by power, but remained untainted by its worst crimes. He supplied the tools, he argued, but he never knew how they would be used. It was a comfortable lie, allowing people to believe that a man could be brilliant and effective, yet somehow insulated from the moral consequences of his actions. But a single document, unearthed from an archive long after Speer had served his prison sentence, tells a different story. It isn't a supply request or a transport schedule, it's a memorandum of a meeting. The subject is technical. The Auschwitz camp commandants were having a problem. The crematoria designed to dispose of the bodies were failing under the sheer volume. They were inefficient. The memo records that Speer's own engineers, experts from his ministry, were consulted, and they provided advice, not just materials, but expertise. They offered architectural suggestions to improve the ventilation of the gas chambers. They provided engineering solutions to increase the throughput of the ovens. They applied the same cold technical problem-solving they used for tank factories to the machinery of mass murder. This is the moment the mask doesn't just slip, it shatters. This is no longer about willful blindness. This is active participation. The architect who dreamed of thousand-year monuments lent his skills to designing a more efficient system for turning human beings into ash. How much do you need to know to be guilty? When does looking the other way become the same as holding the door open? Speer didn't just deliver the bricks. His office helped write the instruction manual. By 1944, the war was being lost on all fronts. The Allies were closing in from the west, the Soviets from the east. The grand avenues of Germania would never be built. The granite from the Mauthausen quarry would never reach Berlin. The Great Hall, the Triumphal Arch. They would all remain ghosts on a tabletop model, a monument to a madman's fantasy. The dream of creation was over, but Hitler's obsessions were not. His focus was simply shifting. If he could not build his new world, he would ensure the old one burned to the ground. What does an architect design when his only remaining building material is ruin? What is the blueprint for the end of the world? The year is 1945. Deep beneath the ruins of the Reich Chancellery, the air is stale with concrete dust and failure. In a map room, lit by a single bare bulb, sits the great model of Germania, a city of dreams, a monument to a victory that will never come. Now, it's just a ghost town on a table, covered in grit from the bombs fallen above. Adolf Hitler, a stooped figure in a stained uniform, stares down at it. His hand trembles, not from rage, but from Parkinson's disease and defeat. For 12 years, this model was his sanctuary, his vision of the future, but that future was dead. If he couldn't have his city, no one could. He picks up a pen to sign an order that will turn all of Germany into its own funeral pyre. On March 19th, the document is issued. Its official title is Coldly Bureaucratic. Demolitions on Reich Territory. History will give it a more fitting name, the Nero Decree. It is a direct order for the total, systematic destruction of the German nation. Everything must go. Bridges, railways, factories, water pipes, power plants, communication lines, food stores, granaries, anything that could sustain life. Hitler's logic is terrifyingly simple, written in his own hand. If the war is to be lost, the nation will also perish. This is not a military strategy. This is a suicide pact, forced upon 80 million people. And who is tasked with executing this final act of nihilism? The man who was supposed to build, not destroy. The order lands on the desk of Albert Speer, Minister for Armaments and War Production. For years, Speer's ambition was to achieve immortality through stone, to build a capital that would last 1,000 years. Now, his only goal is to survive the next 1,000 hours. He holds the power to turn Germany into a barren wasteland, to fulfill his Führer's last insane wish. He travels the country, a phantom in his ministerial car racing between crumbling cities. But he isn't carrying out the order. He is actively sabotaging it. He meets with generals, pleading with them to ignore the command and save the bridges for the retreat. He speaks to industrialists, urging them to shut down their factories, but not to demolish them. This is high treason, born not from a sudden crisis of conscience, but from cold, pragmatic calculation. A dead country has no use for a brilliant administrator. A post-war Germany, however, might. Speer is preserving the infrastructure he will need to rebuild his own reputation. The Gauleiters, the fanatical regional party leaders, are furious. They see Speer as a traitor, a defeatist. They are ready to light the pyre, to see Germany go down in a blaze of glory, a final, epic Wagnerian opera. Speer, the technocrat, sees only waste and inefficiency. He uses the Führer's own bureaucracy against him, issuing counter-orders and creating confusion. He stalls for time, buying a day here, a week there, as Allied armies close in from east and west. Every bridge he saves, every power station he protects, is a direct act of defiance against the man who gave him everything. In late April, with the Red Army in the suburbs of Berlin, Albert Speer makes an incredibly risky decision. He must see Hitler one last time. He finds a tiny, rickety training plane and a pilot willing to fly him into the heart of the apocalypse. They land on the east-west axis, the grand avenue Speer himself designed, now a makeshift runway littered with debris. He makes his way through the rubble of his own architectural dreams and descends into the Führer bunker. Down in the concrete tomb, the atmosphere is suffocating. The air is thick with sweat, fear, and the smell of cheap schnapps. The titans of the Reich are now just hollowed-out men waiting for the end. Speer finds Hitler in the map room. The leader is a wreck, a trembling old man with dead eyes shuffling from room to room. This is not the charismatic patron who once spent nights sketching arches and domes on napkins with him. This is what is left. They are alone. This is the moment, the culmination of their 12-year relationship. The architect stands before his patron and confesses everything. He tells Hitler that he has disobeyed the Nero decree, that he has spent the last month working against his direct orders, saving the very infrastructure Hitler commanded him to destroy. In the Third Reich, this was a crime punishable by immediate execution. Speer was offering up his own life. But the explosion of rage never comes. Hitler doesn't scream or call for the guards. He simply looks at Speer, and for a moment the mask of the Führer falls away. There are tears in his eyes. He speaks, his voice barely a whisper, and tells Speer he knew of his betrayal, that he no longer has the will to punish it. The great terrifying bond between them, the force that reshaped a nation and plunged a continent into war, does not end with a bang. It ends with a whimper, a weak, limp handshake, a quiet dismissal. Speer turns and walks out of the bunker, leaving his creator to his fate. He will never see him again. We can only speculate what passed between the architect and the destroyer as their shared world turned to ash. But it raises a question. What would you have said, standing in that room, to the man who gave you unlimited power only to demand you use it to burn everything to the ground. A few days later, Adolf Hitler is dead, by his own hand. The war in Europe is over. Albert Speer, the builder, the organizer, the survivor, is now a prisoner of the Allies. The man who designed a capital for 1,000 years now faces a new challenge. He must construct his final and most important project, one built not with stone or steel, but with carefully chosen words and calculated omissions. How will the architect of Germania now design the myth of his own innocence? Nuremberg, 1946. The world is watching. In the dock sit the architects of a nightmare. Hermann Göring smirks, defiant to the end. Rudolf Hess stares into nothing, a hollow man. Most of them deny. They deflect. They lie. But one man is different, Albert Speer. He looks directly at the judges, his face a mask of solemn contrition. His voice is steady, clear, as if rehearsed 1,000 times in a silent cell. He says, "I accept responsibility." It was the most calculated performance of his life. The Palace of Justice was not just a courtroom, it was a stage, and Albert Speer, the master of staging, understood this better than anyone. The other defendants were playing for history, for a martyr's legacy in a cause they still believed in. Speer was playing for something much more immediate. He was playing for his life. He knew the evidence against him was a mountain. The memos, the production charts, the photographs. Denying everything was a fool's game, the path to the gallows. So he chose a different path, not denial, but construction. He would build one last project, not from stone and steel, but from words and carefully selected truths. He would build the myth of the good Nazi. His strategy was breathtaking in its audacity. He presented himself not as a fanatic, but as a Faustian figure, a brilliant, apolitical artist who made a deal with the devil. He told the court of his admiration for Hitler, the charismatic leader who gave him the chance to build worlds. He spoke of his work with a technician's pride, detailing the challenges of logistics and engineering. He described himself as a man trapped in his own narrow focus, so obsessed with blueprints and deadlines that he failed to see the horror unfolding around him. In his telling, he was a patriot who worked tirelessly to save his country, a man ultimately seduced and blinded by a monstrous power. He spoke the language of the judges, calm, rational. He was one of them, a professional, not one of the brutes in the dock beside him. He separated himself from the others with every measured phrase. While they shouted about conspiracies and betrayal, Speer spoke of a collective responsibility, a vague philosophical guilt that implicated everyone and no one at the same time. It was a brilliant move. It sounded like a confession, but it was an evasion, a confession without a crime. Then came the prosecution. Justice Robert H. Jackson, the lead American prosecutor, was not a man easily fooled. He had the paper trail, a mountain of it. He laid it out for the world to see. There were the documents signed by Speer, authorizing the use of millions of slave laborers. There were the production reports from his armaments factories, where people were literally worked to death. There were the memos about the eviction of 75,000 Berliners, most of them Jewish, to make way for the grand boulevards of Germania. The evidence was irrefutable. The technocrats' hands were stained with blood. This was the checkmate The evidence seemed insurmountable. And then Albert Speer did something no one expected. He didn't deny it. He didn't try to explain it away. He looked at the documents, looked at the judges, and he agreed. Yes, he had used slave labor. Yes, it was a terrible thing. He framed it as a regrettable necessity of a desperate war, a moral failing he would carry for the rest of his days. Think about the genius of that move. By admitting to the lesser crime, the one they could prove beyond any doubt, he made his denial of the greater crime seem credible. He confessed to being a ruthless administrator to avoid being condemned as a knowing participant in genocide. He sacrificed his reputation as a moral man to save his neck. He admitted to working people to death, but claimed total ignorance of the gas chambers his ministry helped to build and maintain. He established a boundary, and the court, desperate for any sign of humanity in the darkness, seemed willing to believe him. He was the only one to apologize, the only one to express remorse. Was it a genuine act of conscience, or was it the ultimate act of manipulation? This was the man who stood by Hitler for 12 years, the man who visited the Mauthausen quarry and saw the walking skeletons chipping away at the stone for his glorious city, the man who sat in a room while Heinrich Himmler spoke of extermination and later claimed he had stepped out for a moment. He had spent a decade building a world of illusion with light and stone. Now, in this courtroom, he was building his final illusion with words. The verdicts came down like a guillotine, death by hanging for Göring, for Ribbentrop, for Keitel, for Frank. One after another, the leaders of the Reich were condemned. Then the judge called his name, Albert Speer. The courtroom was silent. He had built the weapons that prolonged the war. He had fueled the machine with human lives. He had stood at the very center of power. The sentence was not death. It was 20 years in prison. He had done it. The performance had worked. He had outmaneuvered the prosecution, charmed the judges, and constructed a new identity for himself. He was no longer Hitler's architect. He was Albert Speer, the penitent, the man who saw the error of his ways. He was spared the hangman's noose. But now he faced 2 decades locked away in Spandau prison, 20 years of silence, 20 years of confinement. What becomes of the master builder when he is stripped of his drawing board, his power, and his audience? A prison cell in Spandau. Prisoner number 5 has no stone, no steel, no slaves. His only building materials are paper and memory. He begins to construct his final, most enduring masterpiece. The grandest project of his life would not be built on the plains of Berlin. It would be built inside a room 9 feet long and 7 feet wide. Albert Speer, the man who dreamed of domes the size of mountains, now lived under a single bare light bulb. The Triumphal Arch was meant to dwarf Paris. His window was a narrow slit of gray, unforgiving sky. The Great Hall was designed for 180,000 cheering followers. His cell was designed for 1 man. And for 20 years, it was his entire world. At Nuremberg, he had saved his life by crafting a story. In Spandau, he would perfect it. He was no longer the minister of armaments, no longer the general building inspector. He was the architect of his own legend. Every day, He followed the prison routine, the silent meals, the monotonous work in the garden, the lockstep marches around the yard. But in his mind, he was elsewhere. He was back in the chancellery, leaning over blueprints with the Führer. He was watching the Cathedral of Light pierce the night sky. He was walking through the scale model of Germania, a god in his own miniature city. And he wrote. He wrote relentlessly. He was given paper for letters to his family, and he used every inch. He wrote on scraps of toilet paper in the margins of order forms. He wrote thousands upon thousands of pages. These were not just letters. They were the blueprints for his memoirs, the book that would be called Inside the Third Reich. This was a new kind of construction. The foundation was the myth he had carefully laid at Nuremberg. The bricks were carefully selected memories. The mortar was a mix of charm, intelligence, and calculated omission. He described a Hitler who was not a monster, but a magnetic, almost hypnotic genius, a patron of the arts, a man with a vision. He painted their late-night sessions not as the planning of a totalitarian capital, but as the passionate work of two artists lost in a shared dream. He wrote about his own ambition, framing it as a purely artistic pursuit. He was the apolitical technocrat, seduced not by ideology, but by the scale of the opportunity. He was Faust, and Hitler was his Mephistopheles. It was a compelling story, a tragedy, and it was designed to make the world forget. Forget the eviction notices he signed, which threw thousands of Jewish families onto the street for Germania's grand avenues. Forget the quarries at Mauthausen, where his company profited from men worked to death for his beautiful granite. Forget his signature on documents that allocated resources to expand Auschwitz. In his writings, these inconvenient truths simply ceased to exist. They were edited out of the blueprint. Smuggling the pages out became his primary obsession. It was a complex logistical challenge, just like organizing the war economy. He bribed a sympathetic Dutch orderly. Notes were hidden in tubes of toothpaste, tucked into his dirty laundry, passed in secret. For 20 years, a steady stream of his revised history flowed out of Spandau and into the hands of his allies. He was building his monument, page by page, lie by lie. But his most telling creation in Spandau wasn't written on paper. It was made of soil and seeds. The prison had a large neglected garden, and Speer, prisoner number 5, was put in charge of it. He approached the task with the same meticulous precision he had applied to Germania. He drew up plans. He designed geometric flower beds and perfectly straight gravel paths. He envisioned a journey for the visitor, a walk through a carefully curated landscape. Over the years, he transformed the bleak prison yard into a thing of beauty, a serene, orderly, peaceful space. He planned the seasons, from the first flowers of spring to the rich colors of autumn. It was a small paradise inside a world of punishment, and it was perhaps the most chilling thing he ever did. Because it proved that nothing had changed. He was still the same man, the man who could create an oasis of aesthetic perfection while completely ignoring the monstrous reality it was built upon. The garden was beautiful. It was also surrounded by high walls, barbed wire, and armed guards. It was a miniature Germania, a clean, rational, pleasing surface designed to distract from the brutal system it served. He could find peace in his perfectly manicured flower beds, just as he had found artistic fulfillment in blueprints paid for with human lives. He served his 20 years, to the minute, a debt paid in full according to the court that sentenced him. But you have to ask yourself, can a debt like this ever truly be settled? If a person serves their time, are they owed forgiveness regardless of the crime? His sentence was for a fixed term. The consequences of his actions were permanent. On the 1st of October, 1966, the gates of Spandau prison swung open. A crowd of journalists and photographers pushed forward, their cameras flashing in the pre-dawn darkness. An old man in a tailored suit walked out into the light. He looked less like a convicted war criminal and more like a respected professor. Albert Speer was free. His memoirs, the product of 2 decades of careful construction, were ready for publication. The world was waiting to hear the story of the man who knew Hitler, and he was more than ready to tell it. The television lights are warm. The man in the armchair is handsome, silver-haired, articulate. It's the 1970s. He speaks with a calm, measured tone, a hint of regret in his well-rehearsed voice. This is Albert Speer, the celebrity, the man who saw the devil up close and lived to write a bestseller about it. And the world bought his story. They bought it by the millions. He was the good Nazi, the apolitical technocrat, the artist seduced by a monster. He offered the world a comfortable narrative, a way to understand the incomprehensible. But while the cameras rolled and the royalties poured in, a new generation was starting to read the fine print. They were opening dusty boxes in forgotten archives, and they were finding a very different story. After 20 years in Spandau prison, Albert Speer walked into a world ready to forgive him, or at least ready to listen. His memoir, Inside the Third Reich, was an international sensation. It was a masterpiece of self-creation. In its pages, he was a tragic Faustian character who traded his soul for a chance to build monuments. He painted a portrait of Hitler not as a ranting ideologue, but as a magnetic, almost hypnotic personality. He gave the public what they craved, a human explanation for inhuman evil. He became a fixture on talk shows, a sought-after source for documentaries. He was charming, intelligent, and above all, repentant. He was the perfect guide through the ruins of the Third Reich because he had designed its imaginary cathedrals. He lived a life of quiet luxury in Heidelberg, giving interviews in his study, surrounded by books on art and history. He spoke of his guilt, a general abstract guilt for having been part of the system. It was the performance of a lifetime, and the applause was deafening. He had built his final and most successful structure, a fortress of lies designed to protect his name for eternity. He had constructed the myth of Albert Speer, the respectable monster. Why were people so willing to believe his story for so long? Perhaps it was easier to believe that one brilliant man was seduced than to accept that millions followed willingly. Easier to blame a single charismatic devil than to look at the vast, efficient bureaucracy of murder that men like Speer had managed. But the foundations of his fortress were built on sand. In the late 70s, a young German historian named Matthias Schmidt began to dig. He wasn't interested in Speer's captivating stories or his philosophical musings on guilt. He was interested in paperwork. He combed through the German federal archives looking for documents Speer was sure had been destroyed in the chaos of Berlin's fall. And he found them. He found memos signed by Speer's own hand. Memos from the General Building Inspector's office meticulously detailing the eviction of Jewish families from their Berlin apartments to make way for Germania's grand boulevards. The cold, bureaucratic language was chilling. Apartment cleared. Tenant relocated. There was no mention of the fate that awaited them. The documents didn't need to say it. The paper trail was undeniable. Speer wasn't just an architect dreaming of a new city. He was an active participant in its ethnic cleansing. Then came the journalist Gita Sereni. She spent hundreds of hours interviewing Speer in a long psychological chess match. She found him charming, but she also saw the cracks in his facade. She cross-referenced his claims, his dates, his carefully constructed alibis. She investigated his role as armaments minister and uncovered the truth about the vast network of slave labor that powered his production miracles. Speer had always claimed he was a technocrat, focused only on efficiency, but the evidence showed his ministry constantly demanding more workers from the concentration camps. He knew where they came from. He knew the conditions. His efficiency was fueled by human suffering on an industrial scale. With each new book, each new article, the image of the good Nazi began to crumble. The charming old man on television started to look more like a calculating liar. The evidence mounted, piece by damning piece. Photographs of him smiling at the Mauthausen quarry. The stairs of death visible in the background. Production reports from factories that used slave laborers from Auschwitz. He had an answer for everything. He hadn't seen, he hadn't known. He was too busy. The excuses were polished from decades of practice. He compartmentalized. He delegated. He looked away. The central pillar of his entire defense, the lie he had told at Nuremberg and repeated for 35 years, was about a single event, a speech given by Heinrich Himmler in the town of Posen in 1943. In that speech, Himmler spoke openly, explicitly, to an audience of high-ranking Nazi officials about the final solution, the systematic extermination of the Jewish people. Speer was on the attendance list, but he always swore he had left the conference early to meet with Hitler in Prussia. It was his ultimate alibi. He could not have known the regime's deepest secret because he wasn't in the room when it was spoken aloud. For decades, it was his word against a list of names. Albert Speer died of a stroke in London in 1981. He went to his grave a wealthy man, his books still selling, his myth tarnished but largely intact for the general public. He thought he had won. He thought his final blueprint, the blueprint of his own innocence, would stand the test of time. He was wrong. Years after his death, a private letter surfaced. It was written by Speer in 1971 to the widow of a Belgian resistance fighter. In it, he was trying to console her, to explain his own role. And in a moment of stunning honesty, or perhaps fatal arrogance, he wrote the words that would destroy his legacy forever. He admitted it. "There is no doubt," he wrote, "I was present as Himmler announced on October 6, 1943, that all Jews would be killed. The lie was exposed. The central pillar of his life's great performance had collapsed into dust. He was in the room. He heard the words. He knew everything. The architect who dreamed of buildings that would last 1,000 years had built his own life on a lie that couldn't even last a single lifetime. His buildings were never built. His reputation is now in ruins. So what, in the end, is the true legacy of Hitler's architect? We are in Berlin, not the Berlin of 1945, a city of ghosts and rubble, not the Berlin of the 1930s, electric with a terrible new energy. We are in the Berlin of today. A tour guide stands before a group of visitors, pointing to a strange colossal block of concrete. It's half buried in the earth, overgrown with weeds and scarred by graffiti, a forgotten relic. The guide explains that this is the Schwerbelastungskörper, the heavy load-bearing body. It was built to test the marshy ground's ability to support an unimaginable weight, the weight of Hitler's Triumphal Arch. This was the first and only piece of Germania ever truly built. It is a tombstone for a nightmare. This concrete cylinder is the last lonely ghost of a city that never was, a city that existed only on paper, in sprawling architectural models, and in the shared obsession of two men. To walk through Berlin today is to walk over the grave of that vision. You just have to know where to look. Let's follow the path of the great north-south axis, the planned centerpiece of Germania. It was meant to be a boulevard wider than the Champs-Élysées, a canyon of white stone stretching for miles. Today, it's the Strasse des 17. Juni, a busy road cutting through the Tiergarten Park. Cars rush past where legions were meant to march. Families have picnics where immense government ministries were designed to loom over the populace. Time and ordinary life have reclaimed the space. At the northern end of this axis, near the modern chancellery, was to be the heart of the New World, the Volkshalle, the Great Hall. Imagine a dome so vast it could swallow St. Peter's Basilica whole, with room to spare. 180,000 people standing beneath a copper-clad roof, staring up at a giant golden eagle. An oculus at the peak, open to the sky, would have created its own weather system inside, rain and snow falling on the masses below. It was designed to make the individual feel like an ant, an insignificant speck in the presence of the state. Today, there is nothing there, not a single stone, just a park, a riverbank, and the glass facade of Germany's modern transparent democracy. The contrast is so absolute, it's almost violent. Let's move south, where the sprawling Tempelhof field now serves as a public park for kite flyers and cyclists. Speer and Hitler envisioned the Südbahnhof, the southern station. This was not meant to be a mere train station. It was to be a gateway, a monumental Roman-style welcome to the capital of the world, with vast barrel-vaulted ceilings and statues dwarfing the trains themselves. It was designed to awe and intimidate every visitor, to communicate the power of the Reich before they even stepped into the city. Now, it is a place of leisure, a symbol of freedom. The only arrivals and departures are those of families heading home after a day in the sun. And what of the other temples of this new religion? The Soldiers' Hall, a grim pantheon for military glory, was planned for the southern end of the axis, a place to deify war. Today, the site is a quiet residential area where the loudest sounds are children playing, The new Führer's palace, a sprawling complex designed with halls so long that Hitler planned to use small vehicles to get from one end to the other, was to replace the old Reich Chancellery. Its intended location is now occupied by apartment blocks and office buildings. The mundane has paved over the monstrous. Every empty space on that grand blueprint represents a human cost. To clear the ground for Germania, Speer's office oversaw the eviction of over 75,000 Berliners. The process was cold, bureaucratic, and brutal. We have the records, the memos signed by Speer himself. One woman, displaced in 1939, later recalled, "They gave us a notice, a few days to pack a lifetime. They said it was for the renewal of Berlin, for a greater future. We were just dust to be swept away." The dream of a city of stone was built on a foundation of broken lives. You might think then that the story ends here. A failed dream, a few forgotten relics, a city that moved on. You would be wrong. The concrete and granite of Germania may have remained in the quarry, but the idea, the architectural DNA of totalitarianism, did not die in a Berlin bunker. It escaped. It became a virus. The ghost of Germania lives on, not in Berlin, but in the capitals of other authoritarian states. Look at Bucharest, at Nicolae Ceausescu's Palace of the Parliament. It is the heaviest building in the world. To construct it, he destroyed a huge part of Bucharest's historic core, displacing 40,000 people. Its cold, neoclassical facade and overwhelming scale are a direct echo of Speer's designs. It is a building that dominates the skyline and the human spirit. Look at Pyongyang in North Korea. Kim Il-sung Square is a vast, empty expanse of granite. It is not designed for people to enjoy. It is a stage, a place for military parades where the individual is lost in the perfectly synchronized mass. All eyes turn to the balcony where the leader stands. It is the Nuremberg rally grounds, perfected and made permanent. Or consider Ashgabat, the capital of Turkmenistan, a city rebuilt in white marble and gold, perfectly symmetrical, inhumanly clean, and eerily empty. It's a Potemkin village on a national scale, a city designed to be viewed, not lived in. It is the Germania model, realized in the desert. The same principles are at work. Use overwhelming scale, sterile perfection, and rigid symmetry to create a sense of awe, insignificance, and absolute state control. These principles can be found in modern buildings all over the world, structures designed to intimidate, to make you feel small. The legacy of Germania is not just a historical curiosity. It is a living warning, written in the language of architecture, about the relationship between power and the spaces we inhabit. The buildings were never built. The man who dreamed them up is long dead. The architect who gave them form has had his carefully constructed myth of innocence torn down, document by document. But the story of Albert Speer and his city of ghosts still holds a final lesson. The final lesson isn't about granite or concrete. It's about the seductive power of a blank canvas. Speer wasn't just building a city, he was designing a new reality, one scrubbed clean of inconvenient history, messy humanity, and moral questions. He offered a blueprint where people were merely figures for scale, and their suffering was a rounding error in the budget. That is the true architecture of tyranny. And that design, The promise to build a perfect world on the ruins of the real one is a blueprint that never goes out of style. Albert Speer's most successful project was not a building. It wasn't the new Reich Chancellery, with its miles of marble corridors, or the Cathedral of Light, that temporary temple of air and promise. It certainly wasn't Germania, the city of stone and ego that haunted his dreams. No, his greatest creation was a work of psychological architecture, a structure built not from granite, but from carefully chosen words, calculated omissions, and a performance of regret so convincing it fooled the world for decades. His masterpiece was the myth of Albert Speer, the good Nazi. This myth wasn't born in a moment of panic at Nuremberg. It was designed, drafted, and constructed with the same meticulous care he gave his blueprints. The foundation was laid in the courtroom, where he accepted a vague collective guilt while denying any specific knowledge of the horrors. He painted himself as a technocrat, an artist seduced by a charismatic leader, a man who lost his way in the corridors of power. It was a compelling story. It was exactly what a world exhausted by war wanted to hear, that evil wasn't a system, but a single mesmerizing man, and that everyone else was just a victim of his spell. For 20 years, inside the stone walls of Spandau prison, Speer worked on the interior of his creation. He wrote thousands of secret letters smuggled out on scraps of toilet paper and order forms. These notes became the scaffolding for his memoirs, Inside the Third Reich. The book was a global sensation. It sold millions of copies and made him a rich and famous man upon his release. He had built his own monument, a literary facade that was elegant, persuasive, and completely hollow. And the world invited him in. Imagine the scene in the 1970s, a television studio, the warm glow of the lights. Albert Speer sits in a comfortable chair, a charming, silver-haired gentleman. He's on the BBC. He speaks calmly, articulately, a faint accent lending gravity to his words. He talks of his tragic mistake, of the intoxicating proximity to Hitler. He warns the audience about the dangers of unchecked power. He is the reformed sinner, the man who has seen the face of the abyss and returned to tell the tale. He looks directly into the camera, into millions of living rooms, and performs his contrition. The audience is captivated. How could this thoughtful, intelligent man be a monster? He couldn't. His story must be true. But while Speer was polishing his legacy on television, others were working in a different kind of light, the cold, fluorescent hum of German archives. Here, historians weren't interested in his performance. They were interested in paper, invoices, memos, minutes from meetings. And they started finding the cracks in his facade. A young historian named Matthias Schmidt dedicated himself to sifting through the mountains of documents Speer assumed had been burned in the final days of the Reich. He found something Speer never accounted for: the meticulous, soul-crushing bureaucracy of the Nazi state. Schmidt unearthed the chronic. This wasn't a personal diary. It was the official day-by-day log kept by Speer's own office staff. It recorded every meeting, every phone call, every decision. And its pages told a different story. An entry confirmed Speer met with SS leader Heinrich Himmler at his field headquarters just after Himmler had delivered his infamous Posen speech, the one where he spoke openly to Nazi leaders about the extermination of the Jewish people. The speech Speer had sworn under oath he never heard, claiming he left the conference early. The Chronic proved he was there. The paper trail became a torrent. Memos signed by Speer allocating funds for the expansion of Auschwitz. Letters discussing the use of concentration camp labor for his building projects. Reports detailing the brutal efficiency of his armaments ministry, an efficiency fueled by millions of slave laborers. This was not the master plan of an apolitical artist. This was the schematic of a manager, a logistics expert who saw human beings as raw materials. The numbers on the page didn't represent lives. They represented units of labor. The suffering was an externality, an inconvenient detail in a grand technical problem. The charming man on television wasn't just looking away. He was holding the ledger. Today, if you go to Berlin, you will not find the Great Hall. You will not see the Triumphal Arch. The grand avenues exist only in faded photographs of a plaster model. The city Hitler and Speer dreamed of is a ghost. But there is one piece of it left, one strange, monstrous remnant buried in a quiet neighborhood. It is called the Schwerbelastungskörper, the heavy load-bearing body. It is a colossal cylinder of solid concrete, wider than a house, weighing 12,650 tons. It was built for a single purpose, to test if the marshy Berlin soil could withstand the weight of the Triumphal Arch. A simple engineering experiment. They sank it into the ground and measured how far it settled. It is still there. A bizarre half-sunken monolith, useless and absurd. A concrete scar on the face of the city. This is the only part of Germania that was truly built. Not a palace, not a monument to victory, but a fat, ugly plug of concrete. A literal physical anchor for a phantom city and a perfect symbol for the entire Nazi dream. An immense, brutal weight, built on a fundamentally unsound foundation. Albert Speer's life is the ultimate cautionary tale. It shows that the most dangerous men are not always the ones who scream slogans of hate. Sometimes they are the quiet ones in the back room, with the charts and the slide rules, the ones who are just trying to do a good job. Speer's sin was not that he was a monster. His sin was that he was an ambitious man, offered the chance to build something eternal, and in exchange for that chance, he agreed to stop seeing other people as human. The blueprint he left behind is not for a city. It is a template for self-deception. It shows how easily talent can be corrupted by ambition, how the desire to create can curdle into a willingness to destroy. And it forces us to look in the mirror. Imagine being offered the project of a lifetime, a chance to achieve greatness. The only cost is to look away, to sign the papers and not ask what they are for, to build your perfect world. What are you willing to ignore? What are you willing to break?